All right, it looks like we're now live. We're starting just a couple minutes early because I see there's already quite a few questions for this AMA session. So I'm going to take this longish one, which has a lot of moving parts to it by Alionic. I study creative writing and English literature at university, and if you want the truth, lately I've started feeling kind of insecure about the subjects I study. I feel that since I'm dedicating my studies to something that doesn't directly contribute anything tangible to society, like medicine, engineering, etc., that I'm no good. Love my subjects, but lately can't shake this feeling. Did you ever experience any similar thoughts throughout your time studying philosophy? And as a matter of fact, I did. And I was just talking with my friend Mark Smith about this great, um, what would you call it, like remedy, this thing that one of my professors told me when I was struggling with similar thoughts. But before I go into that, I want to say that you shouldn't assume that studying medicine or engineering or anything like that automatically provides tangible benefits to or contributes in any tangible way to society. I mean, medicine, you could say that, but most of our doctors here in the United States spend more time filling out paperwork than actually interacting with patients. Some of them don't pay attention to what their patients are saying. I've had doctor visits where I've like gone in, talked to the nurse, the doctor looks at the chart, gets things completely wrong. I have to correct them, and they spend a total of 5 minutes with you before deciding what to do about things. Don't make an assumption that people in other fields are making greater contributions or anything like that. A lot of them are, sometimes actually screwing things up, you know. So it's not as if people who are studying business or communication or any of the STEM degrees are automatically doing more than people in the humanities. And as a matter of fact, sometimes, and it's kind of random when this happens, you run into people that are benefited by something you can bring to mind. I remember a colleague who was very down because, she was doing the right thing, and her fellow colleagues were giving her a hard time. And I brought up something that I'd just been reading from St. Anselm about virtue and vice, and vicious people are going to tear down virtuous people, and it was just right the thing for her at the time that helped put things into perspective. So there's a contingency involved in that. So here is the metaphor that my professor Rick Williams, who may or may not still be alive, he was quite old when I studied with him back in graduate school, gave to me, because I came to him and I had a similar thing with respect to philosophy. Now, he wasn't a philosophy professor, he was a classics professor, but I studied Plato's Symposium with him in the Greek over the course of a semester. And I said, it kind of feels like all I'm doing is like learning stuff that then I'm going to pass on to a new generation of students. And I don't really know whether any of this is genuinely valuable, and what the hell's the point in all of this. And he said, "Well, here's the way I look at it." And he'd actually gotten this from his mentor years earlier. So you can say that on a meta level, something similar to what he was talking about was being expressed. He said, "I'm somebody who sits by a fire, and that fire was going long before I came on the scene." And there was somebody else tending that fire. Sometimes there's more people, sometimes there's less. And there's people who come and warm themselves by the fire, and they're not going to tend the fire, but they find something good, something useful in that fire for the time being. My job is not to turn it into a fancier fire or to pick it up and spread it somewhere else. My job is to sit here by this fire and keep it going. And anything else that happens is gravy. Anything else that happens is nice, but that's my main job, to keep my faculties, my skills, my knowledge base active, to think about this stuff, to look at it from different perspectives, and to continually feed the fire. And if nobody else comes along and decides to take my place after I'm gone and the fire goes out, I did my job. I did good enough. What I did was of benefit. And if somebody else does come along and wants to learn from me how to tend this fire or to figure it out on their own, that's cool too. I found that really helpful myself, and I've passed that on to other people, and they've found it helpful as well. And so that it's sort of a tending fire about tending fire. And I think you can think of some of the things. I mean, provided you're not doing like stuff that nobody is ever going to care about other than a few faddish people. If you're working on stuff that really does matter in the humanities, in literature, we talk about classics and classic literature. I think that you're okay. And the crisis of meaning, you know, of not contributing anything, it hits STEM people too. You can be an engineer and do your job well and wake up in the middle of the night thinking, what the hell good is anything that I'm doing? You can be a doctor, and you can go into other fields and do that as well. Some fields are probably more prone to those sorts of existential crises than others, because it's hard to tell what they actually do. But so, don't get too discouraged about it. It takes a little time to get out of it. Here's one from somebody calling themselves God, which is, pretty hubristic, I think. How does Hegel know that all forms of consciousness collapse and lead to absolute knowledge? Couldn't there be more that he hasn't thought of? Yeah, of course. I mean, whoever told you that Hegel had everything right? I mean, Hegel certainly wanted to bring things to a close in the phenomenology, which is probably what you're referencing, right? Because absolute knowledge. Did Hegel stop writing books? Stop giving lectures? Stop going into the other stuff? Obviously not. Is everything that's in the philosophy of right already contained in the phenomenology? Doesn't seem so to me. Hegel continued to do things, and all forms of consciousness don't collapse and lead to absolute knowledge. They're still out there. Sublation doesn't mean that they cease existing. As a matter of fact, only a very select few get to participate in the absolute knowing that Hegel's talking about at the end of the phenomenology. So you might want to give a rethink to what it is that Hegel is actually saying, and whether Hegel could be partly right or partly wrong. We don't have to necessarily buy into the whole Hegelian set of claims that we often call a system in order to find some of the things interesting or useful. I mean, obviously history hasn't ended in 1807, right? So this is one of those sort of pseudo problems, I think you could say, that you don't necessarily have to impose upon yourself. Here's a good question from Galen. Have you got a favorite speech from the symposium, and also maybe a speech you disagree with, but think we can take a good lesson from nevertheless? Yeah, I mean, I don't really agree. I mean, favorite and agree isn't, those aren't the same thing. I don't actually buy Diotima's speech myself, but I think we can certainly take some good lessons from it. I kind of like the Aristophanes speech a lot because it's this crazy story about um, our sexes and what we were originally and finding the one who fits for us. And there's all these, like, you could call them plot holes in the story that Aristophanes is telling, but he doesn't care because he's a comedian, right? And maybe Plato doesn't even care because he's just depicting Aristophanes in there. I also really like Pausanias's speech, which is, I think, kind of underrated. He makes some interesting observations about how the law works in different places, and how we should think about love and desire. I think that his speech ought to be titled "There Ought to Be a Law." So those are probably my favorite. James asks, "Are you familiar with Pure Grimes and the Noetic Society? If so, are they good resources?" I don't know if they're good resources. I can tell you that when I was doing my philosophical counseling training and certification, he got mentioned as somebody important, in the Socratic method. But I've never actually looked at his stuff. I mean, that's not necessarily a index of quality or anything. There's literally thousands of philosophers whose stuff I haven't looked at. So I'm not really a great person to talk about it. He seems, legit, serious. I don't know about the Noetic Society. And I kind of think the Socratic method, um, good sometimes, kind of overrated for some things. It's not a perfect way of approaching everything, but yeah, I mean, that'd be one of those things you want to check out for yourself. I probably won't get around to it myself. Fabian says, "Glad to see you today. It's been a while." Yeah, good to see you here. Dean, how do you take notes when you read philosophy? Do you mark in the margins of the book? Rarely. I don't take many notes. I've never really been a note taker, even back in K through 12. I would kind of, if it's important to me, I usually remember it. Sometimes I'll make little, if I want to go back to something, I'll make a little indication. Occasionally I underline, but then sometimes I come back and find that I underlined the wrong things. So I'm not a good person to give advice about how to take notes. There's lots of people out there who are much more into that than I am. And I'm kind of an outlier when it comes to that. So what works for me probably doesn't work for everybody else. Jamie Stiles, what is the best fiction book on nihilism you've ever read? I've never read a fiction book on nihilism. Um, if you're asking me instead, what is the best fiction book, and I'm going to extend this to series rather than book, that involves nihilism or raises it as an issue that I've ever read. I mean, offhand, I would say, um, well, there's two answers to that. One would be Ursula K. Le Guin's The Farthest Shore, which is part of the Earthsea trilogy, which then becomes a series of 6 books. And I would add to that the fourth book as well, um, which is in which the main character is Tenar, and I would even include the second book as well, the Tombs of Atuan, because what you're dealing with is the questions of meaning, death, power, what to do, how to deal with conflicts, and all of that sort of stuff. In The Farthest Shore, a mage who is terrified of dying has found a way to break down the wall, or break down the division between the dry lands where the dead are, and the land of the living, of Earthsea. And so, some really interesting speculations in there on Ursula K. Le Guin's part. And then something a bit more contemporary, I would say, um, R. Scott Bakker's uh, Second Apocalypse series, which is 7 books at this point in time. It's set against a universe which is not, it's not a nihilistic set of books, but they are certainly struggling with questions of meaning and whether there is any ultimate meaning within the universe, how we should behave, how we should struggle against evil. Should we, just develop into sort of like seeking power and hedonism or something else? Um, those are some really long books, though. Scott Backer, was also a philosophy graduate student, and you could say that in place of writing his dissertation, he brought out his first book, which has probably done more to promote thinking than most people's dissertations have. So, those would be some good ones. Laps says, "How do you understand Heidegger's notion of the temporal horizon? He describes it in places as the datable content of now or then seems to reflect the focus on intentionality." So a lot of moving pieces there. I mean, let's begin in a straightforward way. We exist in time, right? We exist in temporality as well. And this imposes horizons. And what is a horizon? Well, this is an idea that Heidegger is getting from Husserl. So everything has horizons. The fact that you can't see the back of my head right now means that there's a kind of horizon there, and this is a spatial thing. And you supply, me being a three-dimensional object, even though you're seeing me on a screen, and we're constantly projecting all sorts of things ahead of us into the world that we're perceiving. And that's part of temporality for Heidegger. That's the pre understanding, orientation towards the future. We also have mood or attunement, which is, sort of anchoring us in a past that is coming forward into the present, right? We have thrownness. This is the four equiprimordials, right? And then we have language. And sometimes Heidegger plays around with other stuff as well. And that's sort of like the big picture stuff in being in time. But you could also think of like all different ways in which we make sense out of or project time into things. Like, right now we're 15 minutes into this AMA. How do I know? Because I can see it like ticking away up there, and we're projecting, oh, we're going to be here for another hour and roughly 15 minutes, although sometimes I go over, right? And so these are all, sort of everyday examples of Leander has another Heidegger question. How did Martin Heidegger's philosophy influence you? Um, a variety of ways. I don't know that his influence very often is a matter of just Heidegger influencing me. Heidegger is part of like a number of people talking about similar things that I'm interested in. So, as a sort of phenomenologist looking at the human condition, I would say that what Heidegger has to say for me gets, kind of put together also with what Gabriel Marcel or Maurice Blondel or, Henri Bergson or Max Scheler, all of his contemporaries, right, have to say about things. Instead, why don't I say like what I think is cool about Heidegger's philosophy? So there's a point that he makes in what is metaphysics that I think is really, quite good, which is that you know, whenever you start looking at one genuinely metaphysical question and you start pulling at the threads of it, you find that it's connected to other ones. I think he's completely right about that. You can't just work on this problem by itself in strict isolation from everything else, like you're some sort of weird robot type, the way that some philosophers want to do. They all bleed over into each other. And so metaphysics is going to be messy. So's ethics, by the way, right? I mean, this is one place where I don't agree with Heidegger, and I do agree more with like Max Scheler, Gabriel Marcel. Ethics is just as important as metaphysics. It's not like doing ethics puts blinders on and gets us, automatically off the track, and we start, restricting being. I really like Heidegger's treatment of mood, you know, and emotions. I think that that is incredibly helpful and valuable. But he's building off of previous thinkers. I mean, he brings up Aristotle, and says Aristotle's rhetoric, book two, is the first hermeneutic of, I think he says hermeneutic of everydayness. And he's talking about the stuff on the emotions, right? This is in Being and Time as well. I do like the discussion of how human freedom introduces something new into existence, and it does so precisely by moving out into the nothing. I think that's actually, people make fun of Heidegger for that, but I think those are people who don't really understand what Heidegger is trying to get at. Um, what else? I mean, I enjoy reading Heidegger's discussions of previous philosophers. I don't always think he's, completely right about it, but I do think that he's quite insightful. So, those are some examples. Marco says, is it important for a philosophical study of Aristotle to know if his surviving texts are what he actually wrote, or if the texts were distorted over the centuries by copying and editing? Um, for almost 99.9% of us, that's a side issue that's of very little relevance. I mean, how the hell would you know, right? You're going to have to trust some experts somewhere. And it's not like we're back in the Renaissance with some, dusty manuscripts in front of us, like which of these are genuine, I mean, we've got like 200 years plus of people who've devoted, their lives and careers to putting together critical editions of things. So I think most people who quibble about that sort of stuff are just wasting their time rather than using it for something valuable, like actually reading the texts and figuring out what they mean, right? So no, it's not really that important anymore, particularly for Aristotle. Anything where we've got critical editions, I think, unless you're going to become a textual scholar, you do like I do, and you say, okay, these are what we're going to work with. Thank you for putting together these critical editions. So I think that's kind of a non-starter. Andy, what do you think of concept albums? If you enjoy them, do you have a favorite concept album? That's a good question. I mean, I think it's tough to pull off a concept album. And here I'm going to say some broader stuff about music and sort of like programmatic ideas in general. I'm also going to fix this light a little bit. There we go. A little blind there. That's nice. So, the first concept album that I ever heard was Pink Floyd's The Wall, right? And that was a big deal for us as kids. We could relate to a lot of it, not only because teachers kind of sucked back then, education wasn't great, but where you could think about the fears involved in like the song Mother, and of course we weren't like, well, some of the kids were doing drugs, they're mostly sniffing glue, but I didn't get into that. So there was, you could talk about the drug use and being burnt out. And then, of course, you get older, you get into high school and college, and Pink Floyd The Wall is really cool back then. I mean, now I see it as kind of not very interesting to me. And then the next big concept album that I think I paid attention to was Queensryche's Operation Mindcrime, right? Um, and that was pretty cool too. I mean, great songs. There's an interesting, coherent narrative. By that time, there were videos going along with it. Um, but I think there's limitations to concept albums. You know, you can like talk about, sing about, play about cool things, but there's a sort of superficiality to most concept albums, I think, right? Um, because there's only so much you can actually do, and it winds up being kind of slogany, and I don't know, not it can be, they can be good gateways into thinking about things, but I don't know that most concept albums really measure up over time, other than just being about the thing that they're about. They're not like a blueprint for how to live our lives. Um, and I'm going to talk about a different thing. Um, we went and saw Rage Against the Machine this summer at Alpine Valley, and I was really struck. I mean, there were two things I was really struck by, and my wife was also struck by one of them. Um, there was zero interaction between the band and the audience, which I guess is kind of common for them. But to me, why do a live performance if you're not actually going to engage with the audience? I mean, we may as well just listen to the record, right? So that was a weird thing. But it's also reflective of something else. While Rage Against the Machine was doing their, wiki, guitar stuff that, ooh, is so amazing. I actually find that stuff really boring. And while the singer was, ranting about this and that, and, going into all this sort of like hard left resistance stuff, and they're playing these images on the background, I was reflecting on it. I was like, wow, this stuff is really superficial. I mean, and put aside the hypocrisy of like how rich the band members are and how they don't engage with their audience anymore. And just think about the words itself. They're cool, but they're not a political program. They're not a substitute for actual thinking, praxis. As a matter of fact, they can be a great distraction from that. And if you looked out at the crowd, it was Run the Jewels and Rage against the machine. And who are the most of the people in the crowd? Were they people who are like, yeah, I'm going to transform society, man, and resist the forces of fascism and, capitalism and commercialism and all that? No, they're just a bunch of drunk, 40-year-olds who remember hearing this stuff when they were younger and maybe actually cared about stuff, hooting and hollering and going around and acting like anybody else at a concert, right? So coming back to concept albums. I mean, think about like Queensryche was engaging in a very interesting social critique in Operation Mindcrime. Did it really mean anything? Nah, not really, unfortunately. So you could say I'm not super into to concept albums. All right. Zishan, what's your take on zoophilia and minor attracted persons? Is it morally okay in your opinion? Definitely not morally okay in action. And I would say that if you've got, attractions like that, you probably want to do some reflection about is this something appropriate? I was just actually talking with somebody. I mean, we don't even have to go to like extreme stuff like that. I was talking with somebody just the other day about there are these skeevy professors who are like my age, and they hit on college students who are generally 18 to 24-year-old. And I was thinking, I was saying, if you're 50 years old and you're still finding yourself primarily attracted to people that young, there's some maturation that hasn't happened in your development, and you should look at yourself and wonder what's going on. And instead of like appealing to like evolutionary psychology or other pseudosciences, you should actually like look at yourself and say, how did I get so screwed up, that I can't be attracted to somebody my own age? um I think there's something to that, and that's probably enough to say about those sorts of things. All right. Tina says, love this off the cuff style of discourse, even better than your lectures. Very comfy and natural. I'll take your word for that about the comfy part. I think that's one of those younger generation words that I may not know the full extent of, but it sounds good. Chim, I take your book organization as a personal affront. I'm not sure how you could possibly see what my book organization is. Um, from this. You can't see the titles, except of maybe a few of them that have really big words on them. But if you want to take something as a personal affront, well, life is short, so you know you can think about that. Maximum. I was invited to write an article in a magazine. I'm a scholar in criminal law. I want to write something about criminal law in connection with philosophy. Do you have any suggestions? Google would be very helpful. I'm sure that if you enter criminal law philosophy, there will be like hundreds of entries that come up, and they could furnish you with all sorts of idea. I don't know that any of them would be more germane to you or your studies because I don't know you, so I don't know what you should write on. Zach says, no, I haven't chatted in a while, but hope you're doing well. Thanks. I hope that you're doing well as well. David Reynolds has a completely out of context question here. Doesn't he say you should believe in God even if there is no God? I don't know who the he is there. So that sounds like a factual question that could be easily answered by reading somebody's book. Uh, Rulento, how can I decide when I'm prepared to start reading the next philosopher I want to, going from Plato to Aristotle? With philosophy, it's hard to realize if I've understood enough. So that one actually I can answer. Um, you've understood enough when you're ready to read something else. I mean, that sounds tautologist, but hey, it's your brain. You, right? You should be able to figure out whether you've made enough progress. And it's not like once you've read Plato, you can never, ever, ever go back to him. I mean, you will go back to him because you're going to forget half the stuff that you think that you learned um, within, a little while. And, you move on to other philosophers like Aristotle's going to say some stuff about Plato. And then you're going to be like, is that what Plato actually said? Let me go back to the Plato text, right? So there isn't a formula for this. I would say that what you want to do, or what you could do. I mean, I don't know what you want. What I would suggest doing is not worrying about whether you've learned enough. And when you feel like you could go into Aristotle, just start reading Aristotle. This doesn't have to be like a very formulaic, systematic. We have to do this first and this prerequisite. It's your brain. You can read whatever the hell you want. You don't even have to like necessarily read Aristotle. You could go right from Plato if you want to Rene Descartes, and then come back again. There isn't any. Um, I mean, people present it as if, oh, you got to do this first, and then this first, and then this first, or else it's no good. Those people are full of crap. They don't know what they're talking about. Um, there's many ways to study philosophy. So when you uh, want to start reading Aristotle, just start reading Aristotle. And you don't even have to stop reading Plato. You can have two books open at the same time. All right, Dan the Man, longtime subscriber and commenter. And his comment just jumped because so many people are weighing in, and it updated. Let me see if I can find this again. Here we go. Was there ever a point where you felt jaded by philosophy? Just graduated from my master's a few weeks ago, and I haven't wanted to think about philosophy at all lately. Yes, there have been times, and they often do coincide with exactly the sort of thing that you're talking about, where you've been like investing all this time and thought and energy and maybe even like worry and communication into a philosophical project. So if you just finished your master's, you finished up with your coursework, you defended your master's thesis, that's a lot of work, right? And you put a lot of time and energy into it. And then you get done, and it's even more so like after you finish your dissertation. Some people get depressed after that. Other people are like, I don't want to think about this dissertation topic for another couple years. Let me just read something else. I mean, I kind of did that with my dissertation, which was kind of a hot mess now that I think about it. um, I mean, it's kind of fortunate I didn't try to publish it, because that would have been a lot of frustration, because it really should be like split into a couple different books. Can you hear the rain? We got a crazy rainstorms going on here in Milwaukee, with like gale force winds out on the lake, and we're probably gonna have some flooding and stuff like that. Anyway, back to the topic. Yeah, it's totally natural to have times where you're like, yeah, I don't feel like doing philosophy. You know, I do a good bit of my reading actually in the tub, because I like taking hot baths, for my joints and stuff like that. And like not quite at the level of Churchill, who would conduct all of his business in the bath, but like Alistair McIntyre, who told us when we were in the seminar that he enjoyed reading in the bath. Sometimes I'll bring books, and I'm like, yeah, I'm going to read this Cicero, on the ends, so I can talk about it. And instead, I just read some stories, or I just like fall asleep in the tub or something like that, right? I mean, there's you can't. I mean, you can force yourself to read stuff, but you can only do that so long. And you've probably been doing that quite a lot while you were preparing for your masters, right? So um, maybe take a couple weeks and just like chill out and do other stuff for a while. Ridicule, the private vices yield public virtues, or just general thoughts on that idea. No, I think most of the PR for private vices yield public virtues tends to be BS and very selective. I mean, that's a slogan, but slogans shouldn't be a substitute for actual thinking. Private vices tend to lead to public vices and screwed up situations and injustice and exploitation and all that sort of stuff. I mean, think about greed, right? Does greed really create public virtues? No. Does it even create public benefits? Well, kind of, but usually with the externalities placed on somebody else's shoulders who we're not even seeing. So I would avoid that kind of slogan. Um, all right, let's see here. Ariel, do you have any horror books or movies to recommend? Um, yeah, I mean, I do. So let's think about books. I'm still a fan of Lovecraft, as racist as he is. I mean, he even doesn't like Portuguese and French Canadians. And he's pretty awful when it comes to that. But he is also a master at writing horror stuff. Um, I did Bram Stoker's Dracula a couple years ago in the Worlds of Speculative Fiction, and also the Lair of the White Worm, and I kind of like that stuff. I think I would like to go back to it eventually. Um, who else in horror? I mean, there's all this great stuff out there at this time that is done in the Lovecraftian universe. And I mean, I actually like find these books, these anthologies on Kindle, and nobody like automatically comes to mind as like the great author, but you can easily search that. Somebody who I'm a big fan of, you can think about horror fantasy, and there's two authors who I particularly like when it comes to that. Both of which, unfortunately, are long past. One of which is Carl Edward Wagner with his Kane stuff, and Tanith Lee, who's incredibly prolific, and she wrote across sci-fi, fantasy, horror. She's really I really like her quite a lot. And as far as like movies, so it was just Halloween, and we didn't actually make the time to watch any horror movies because we were coming down off of Stoicon and all that sort of business. But um, one of the scariest movies for me, and when I watched it, it still held up. I watched it like about 10 years ago. Prince of Darkness. Um, that is a creepy, creepy movie, especially towards the end. So there's a lot of other great ones out there. We live in kind of a wonderful time when it comes to streaming content, right? There's more than you could possibly ever watch. Um, Jacob says, "Don't have a question yet, but wanted to say hello and thanks for what you do." Great. That's You don't always have to have a question. Um, Zeitgeist, for someone living in Wisconsin, have you ever listened to Midwest emo? I didn't even know there was such a thing as Midwest emo, but I suppose it makes sense that there is. I'm not into emo stuff, so you know, I probably haven't heard any of it, unless I've walked through a place where somebody was playing it from time to time or something like that. I think it is kind of cool that there is such a thing as Midwest emo. I wonder if there's anything like Midwest metal, you know, maybe Midwestern themed, Um, Laps, have you ever tried listening to black metal? I find it to be a thoughtful genre. Yeah, I mean, I listened to Venom when Venom was, brand new, sort of the godfathers of black metal. I got bored with much of the stuff that was coming out later because it often is very technically proficient, but I don't get into it. I'm not into black metal. I'm not into death metal. I'm not into, Viking metal. There's a lot of like genres that I don't have to be into. Cool that you are, but you know, I got other stuff I like listening to, you know. Um, all right, let's see what else we've got here. Um, Let's see. Mario, are you worried about the future of the United States? Um, I am not worried about the future, but I am pessimistic about the future. And I'm not worried about it because I look at things in a bigger perspective. I'm an American, just like Augustine was and Boethius were Romans, and the Roman Empire is long gone and was falling apart when they were around. Um, but the stuff that they did was still valuable. And I'm not saying that I'm like an Augustine or Boethius that my stuff is going to be around 200, 500, 1,000 years, plus from now. But um, if the United States goes away, that doesn't mean it's like humanity disappears or something. As a matter of fact, the American experiment, I would say, has been effectively derailed. If you read like classical American literature, you see that at least a lot of the people in America, despite doing terrible things, they at least had this concept like we better not screw this up. You know, think about like John Winthrop and the City on a Hill, sermon. Um, he's like, listen, uh, we've got a unique opportunity here. Let's not screw it up. Think about Alexis de Tocqueville, this French observer of what's unique to American democracy. That's almost all gone. That's long, long gone, you know? And even the conservatives are like in love with state power, and coercion and stuff like that. Um, and I think that our political system is in effect stuck in gridlock in some places, sliding into fascism in other places. There's been a breakdown of political and social mores, as I talked about in a live stream about probably a year ago. Um, we're sort of a paper tiger when it comes to a lot of economic, educational matters. We spend way too much money on a military that is not giving us the dividends that we need, and we piss it away on, upper rank people who are just part of an elite that get to run things, and on equipment, and we do terrible caretaking of our veterans after they get out. That's not where the money is. We've got two political parties, one of which is mostly well intentioned, but often seems to be like three steps behind their opponents, and one that over the last 20 to 15 years has degenerated into crazy lovers of cruelty, fascism, owning the libs and all this sort of stuff. And we have a media environment that promotes all of this kind of crap. So I'm not very optimistic about this country or what's going to happen. That said, I grew up here. I'm going to stay here and do what I can to help improve things in little ways. So, all right. Minji, where is Evil Sadler? Bring him back, you fiend. He comes out kind of randomly whenever he wants to, very often topically oriented. I'm sure you'll see him before too long. Um, yeah, like Zeitgeist points out, Evil Sadler comes out when he wants to, as an uncontrollable entity. And let me say too, my advice is you shouldn't listen to anything that Evil Sadler says because he's full of crap. Bicameral monk, are you familiar with? Do you have any opinions on the recapitulation theory of atonement? No, that's not a term that I'm familiar with. I'm sure it's popular in some group or something. Mario, what do you think Plato would have written about in today's world about a perfect state within the possibilities of a decentralized blockchain technology? I think that Plato would have taken one look at that and been like, "Holy crap, a new cave." For people who think that they're out of the cave. So that's probably enough to say about that. Ian, if you could have majored in anything else other than philosophy, what would it be? Well, that's an interesting question because I did major in something else besides philosophy. I double majored in philosophy and mathematics. And if I hadn't been so tired of being in college, I actually had the opportunity to triple major because, interestingly enough, our history of philosophy classes, of which I took, let's see, ancient and medieval, modern, contemporary. I took three. That would have counted towards a history major at the college that I was going to. And I also had taken a couple other history classes just for fun. And then there was like in World Civ 1 and World Civ 2. So I think I had like on the books like I want to say like 7 classes if I would have continued on, and I only needed like 10 classes to triple major. But I just didn't feel like hanging around for another semester, so I didn't do it. Um, I mean, it was kind of random that I got into philosophy anyway. I've talked about this at many points. Um, I could actually I considered changing my major to writing, and I think I've certainly told this story elsewhere, but I may as well tell it again very briefly. So Carl Elder was a writing and English professor at Lakeland College, and I would sit in on the poetry classes that he taught. In part because I was going out with uh, a girl who was a writing and art major, and so I would hang out with them, and I'd bring in my poetry. And Elder was very critical of everybody's stuff, and I respected his opinion. And I thought, I want to be a writer. I still want to be a writer today, actually. And I went into his office, and I was like, I'm thinking about switching from philosophy to English and writing. And he said, "Oh, it's a terrible idea. Don't do that." And I said, "Well, why shouldn't I do that?" He said, "Oh, all these friggin' kids come in my class, and they're all like basically doing these meta projects where they're writing about being writers, and you got to actually have something to write about. And so if you study philosophy, you could do writing, but you got something that you can think about and write about, and you're reading some other stuff, not all these pretentious English people. You'll be so much better off doing that." And I was like, "Well, that actually makes sense." And so um I didn't change my major. So yeah. Um, Ken, never ceases to amuse me that there's a traditional metal revival genre. It must be said it features some great bands, though. Nice to see traditional metal surviving and thriving. Yeah, I mean, I think there's so Ken, by the way, is a longstanding uh, commenter and has been part of the classic metal classes that Scott Trulli and I were doing before our schedules got in the way, and we're hoping to take that up again. So I think you can say that there's really three intersecting, let's call them traditional heavy metal things. So there's heavy metal from the time before it was traditional heavy metal because it was just heavy metal, the 1970s and the 1980s, right? And some of these bands got their start in the 1970s. Like think about, of course, Black Sabbath and Deep Purple and Uriah Heep, and then Judas Priest and Motorhead and Van Halen and Rat and of course there's Kiss in the background. Iron Maiden forms in the 70s but doesn't release their first album until 1980. And so you got all these different bands that are doing all this cool stuff, right? And where exactly the boundaries of metal and hard rock or prog rock are, that's difficult to say. So I'm not going to get into those weeds. So we got that stuff, right? And you can think about like Twisted Sister as an example too. They are classic or traditional heavy metal, sort of like go ahead punch through stuff. They played a lot in clubs before releasing their first album. I want to say in like 81 maybe. Um, so anyway, you got that, right? So that's one kind. And then we have the continuation of those bands into the present. So like, I'm going to go and see Wasp, an Armored Saint, next week, and Wasp is gonna do, probably mostly like the stuff from the 80s, but there'll be like some newer songs from the 90s and early 2000s in there as well. We saw Michael Schechter group just the other day, and they played a lot of old cut UFO stuff. Actually, about close to half the concert was UFO stuff from the 70s, and then it was Michael Schechter group stuff, and some of it was things that I could easily identify: Armed and Ready, Cry for the Nations, these standards. But then there was stuff like off of very recent albums, which I'm a little ashamed to admit I've only listened to once or twice. And so that's also traditional heavy metal, right? So now we got two kinds: the original stuff from the original era, continuation of these bands into the present. And then we've got like a whole wave of bands from the 2000s onward who are like, I want to play this old kind of stuff. And yeah, some of what they do is pretty cool. There's other bands that it's hard to say where they fit in with that, like Primal Fear, for example, right? Um, very very Judas Priesty sounding, in the way that like Orchid is very Black Sabbathy sounding. Um, And maybe they kind of straddle the classic era and the contemporary era as well. So, yeah. All right. Wim says, "Who do you like the most out of these three, and why? Deleuze, Lacan, or Derrida?" For me, that's no contest. I like Lacan better than the other two. I mean, I enjoy reading Deleuze, less so when he's working with Guattari, more so when he's doing his own thing. I enjoy reading some Derrida when he's not farting around with all sorts of word games and wasting our time with that kind of bullshit, which half the time that he's making a point, he is doing. Lacan is also subject to a little bit of preciousness, writing in obscure ways. And there's some false starts, I would say. Whenever Lacan starts talking about mathematical formulas, just tone that out because that kind of stuff seems kind of ridiculous to me. But Lacan, as Alistair McIntyre pointed out, um, was working within a tradition. Even though he's very anti traditional, he's working within a tradition of psychotherapy that ultimately can't be just about like theorizing. It has to be about like helping people figure out how screwed up they are and helping them to get a little bit less unscrewed up so they can live a better life, right? So, and I enjoyed Lacan's writings more than I do these other two. Um, Ariel says, "Do you have any living philosophers you like?" I have many of them. Some of them are my colleagues. Some of them are people with big star power who I've met. I mentioned Alistair McIntyre, living philosopher, the real deal when it comes to virtue ethics. Cool guy. I had the chance to interact with him years back for a while, and I try not to place any especially since he's so old. I don't want to like take up his time with trying to bother him about stuff because he's got plenty of people doing that. Julia Annas, I got to meet her at Stoicon years back. That was like getting to go behind. That was like getting to be backstage at a rock concert with your favorite people. Anthony Long, similar sort of stuff. We'd have these dinners after the Stoicons, or sometimes before, where we'd get to like hang out and chat and stuff. Um, like Christopher Gill, of course, really wonderful guy. There's and there we're talking about people who are like emeritus status, but there's plenty of contemporary people who I like as well. Some of whom I've got to meet and interact with largely through, either the Institute for St. Anselm Studies or the Modern Stoicism organization or the Aristotelian Studies thing. So yeah, there's lots of contemporary thinkers who I like. Um, C says, "Enjoy Tolstoy. Just finished some of his short stories. I have to say, Master and Man and The Death of Ivan Ilyich were sensational." Yeah, Tolstoy's pretty good. He's also got he's got an interesting book that I teach sometimes parts of to my students at Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design. What is art? So I enjoy him. Raid, are there any books analyzing fascism you would recommend? Yeah, there's actually a whole bunch. I've actually written an encyclopedia article years back that you can find in my academia.edu, I think, where I've got like a bibliography of the stuff. There have been new things since then. Like I think Paxton's book on fascism came out after that. Um, you know, Ernst Nolte sometimes gets dinged a lot, but I think his Three Faces of Fascism is still pretty good, and it's nice because it brings in the integral nationalism and not Alliance Française, Action Française, as being a proto-fascist organization. Um, I want to say Paxton's book is Varieties of Fascism, but there's a number of good works out there that you can find from like the 1980s onward that explore it. You want to avoid the ones where they've clearly got an axe to grind, you know, or where it's kind of weird crap like what was his name? Jonas something's liberal fascism, which was right about some things but wrong about others. So yeah. All right, Cody, do you prefer teaching Hegel or Kant, and why? Either one's fine. I don't have a preference. I'm not a Hegelian or a Kantian, but they both are interesting. I'd say Hegel's tougher to teach in part because everything's so interconnected, but yeah. Um, R.T. Whitby, did Aristotle think virtue was a means to the end of eudaimonia, or did he think that virtue was valuable in and of itself, or both? Obviously, both, right? This is something that there's a whole ream of scholarship out there on, and a lot of people waste time with this. I think it's super clear in the text that, you know, if happiness consists in eudaimonia, the life of active virtue, well, then it's not just a means end thing, it is inclusive. And the more virtuous you are, provided you also have friends and enough wealth to keep a roof over your head, the happier you're going to be. I don't know why. There's a lot of like tiffs that people get into about Aristotle. Is Aristotle's view on friendship altruistic or egoistic? Neither. Those aren't categories that are really applicable there. People get themselves, I think, very often in these kind of artificial binds that they don't need to. Um, all right, let's see here. Oops, just skipped a little bit. Um, let's try to take some people we haven't had already. Um, Austin says, "I'm in a intro to philosophy class. I want your opinion on the Dr. Seuss Horton Hears a Who to Plato's allegory." That seems silly. I'm not going to bother with that. So, uh, I mean, the allegory of the cave, Horton Hears a Who. I guess they're both about like hearing, seeing something somebody else doesn't. But why do those two? What does it have to do with being in an intro class? Piffle, who do you find to be the most interesting philosophers of the last 20 years? I mean, there's interesting, and then there's interesting for me. And interesting for me is going to be a very much smaller category because I'm not reading most of the philosophers who have written in the last 20 years. As a matter of fact, people are often like, "What do you think of so and so?" And I'm like, "I've never heard of so and so," and that's kind of normal. Um, Last 20 years. Okay, so we're making the cutoff 2002. Um, am I reading a lot of stuff from that? I mean, so some of the people I've already mentioned, like Alistair McIntyre, Julia Annis, Margaret Graver has some great stuff as well in ancient philosophy. Obviously, Christopher Gill. Um, people doing like contemporary continental, I don't really pay that much attention to most of them, in part because I don't find what they're doing all that interesting or helpful. So I don't know. I probably have to pass on that, right? Um, so let's see. Colamus. What do you think about R.G. Collingwood? I got a hold of his autobiography in Boston. I quite like it. Collingwood's an interesting thinker. By the way, I've mentioned McIntyre a couple times. Guess who wrote on Collingwood? McIntyre, and he liked Collingwood quite a bit. The things that I've read, and I can't say that I've read much or that it's been very recent. I've enjoyed. So he's worth checking out. Rexall Queespog, any insights on John Henry Newman's philosophy? It's been like decades since I've read him, so I don't have any insights in particular about his philosophy. Um, Nietzsche says, "We turn to art for this moment when we know something, we feel it, but we can't articulate it because it's too complex and multiple." Great quote, human all too human. Oh, okay. Well, there you go. Said, I struggle with understanding some of the philosophical texts, such as those of German idealism, phenomenology, and existentialism. I was curious if you could offer some solution to this problem. The problem of struggling to understand things. I don't have anything that can contribute to that other than saying understanding is something that you develop cumulatively. It's not an on-off switch. It's something you have to work at. We all struggle understanding some things, you know? It's not like when I'm shooting the half-hour Hegel videos, I just, like, read the passage and I'm like, "Oops, there it is. Let's get up there and shoot," you know? I have to reread it and think about what's there and what I want to say. That's kinda par for the course. So, um, it gets better, I think, over time, but you don't have to like place a burden on yourself that you have to understand everything. There's going to be some people who you just can't make heads or tails of. And it could be because what they have to say isn't all that coherent, or it could be because you yourself aren't ready for studying them at that time. You're jumping, like all these people who are like, oh, I got to study Kant's critique of pure reason. It's so important. How do you know it's so important? You're trusting somebody else who said that it was so important, who might, have as little understanding of the text as you do. I mean, if I had to pick a text that like is the hallmark for philosophy, it sure as shit wouldn't be Kant's critique of pure reason. And if I was going to recommend studying one of Kant's critiques and getting something out of it, I'd probably recommend the second critique, the critique of practical reason. But people get very, invested in this idea that if they're not understanding something, they're really missing out on it. So just, kind of keep working at it, I would say. Ethan Bishop, what would Plato think about 2022 Republicans and the midterms in America? I mean, Plato would hate their guts because they're pretty despicable. Republicans, I've actually been a registered Republican at one time, and I've been involved in Republican races. The Republican Party of today is almost unidentifiable in relation to the Republican Party of, say, 1985. There are so many positions on which they've reversed their viewpoint, or they've like torn apart the legacy. um, Plato would say, well, these are basically corrupted, degenerate people who want to believe things that clearly aren't true, and they're motivated by malice, spite, envy. They've really made a mess of themselves, and they are a big feedback loop making a mess of themselves. He wouldn't necessarily say that the Democratic Party is great people either, but um, it's not night and day. It's sort of like darkest night and twilight. You can still see in one of them. So that, I think that's probably what Plato would say. Um, Andre says, I read a lot. Maybe it's a lot of Montaigne's on education of children. Oh, a lot of Montaigne's education of children thoughts resonated with me. What would you read next on philosophy of education? Whatever the hell you want to. I mean, it's not as if you have to read everything in a perfect chronological order. I guess if you want to read modern philosophy on education, you could read Rousseau's Emile, or you could read Locke's thoughts on the education of children, or you could read Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women, which is arising. It's written specifically to a minister of education during the French Revolution. Or you could go backwards in time and read Plato, and the Republic has all sorts of interesting things on education, or whatever you want to. It's up to you. I don't have like a syllabus of what you have to do. Um, all right. Online person. Does Hegel's negative portion of dialectic and the phenomenology of spirit rely on a certain type of alienation? And is this related to Heidegger's nothingness? No and no. I wouldn't try to like theorize in those ways. That's sort of like the big, top down kind of stuff that people take. If you're going to read the phenomenology of spirit, just read the phenomenology of spirit. Don't approach it with a whole bunch of preconceived ideas, because Hegel tells you not to do that in the very preface, right? So I wouldn't do that. And is it related to Heidegger's nothingness? Read Heidegger on Hegel. Yeah, he's got a whole book on the lectures on the phenomenology of spirit, which unfortunately only goes up to the self consciousness phase. See if Heidegger talks a lot about the nothing there, right? Uh, he doesn't. So William Zen. Will reading all of Frederick Oh, you must be Cobblestone, right? Frederick Cobblestone's History of Philosophy books be enough to get a good grasp of the history of philosophy? Do you think we can get a good enough background to read philosophy well? I think it sure as hell can't hurt, right? Cobblestone is pretty reliable. Obviously, Cobblestone died a while back, so there's some things that have happened since then. Um, and should you be relying primarily on somebody's history of philosophy, or should you be reading the primary texts themselves? Cobblestone is not trying to provide you with a substitute for actually engaging with the texts themselves. He's trying to provide you with a fairly reliable guide, and I think he's pretty good usually, but certainly better than Bertrand Russell. I would say he's actually probably better than Grayling, who's a contemporary person who wrote a history of philosophy recently. Um, but there's going to be gaps. There's going to be things that are left out that Cobblestone, just as much as Grayling, are not very aware of. You're not going to find a lot of women philosophers who deserve to be looked at in either of their histories of philosophy or Russell's. Or yeah, I would say too, um, if you're going to read somebody, read Cobblestone. Definitely do not waste your time with William Durant's The Story of Philosophy, because that is so often off base about things, and very selective. So, all right, Ethan Bishop, what would Aristotle think about the Electoral College? I mean, he would call that part of the what he calls a constitution. I know that here in America, we're used to thinking of the Constitution as like a written document, but for Aristotle, constitution, politeia, means like the arrangements within a society. And I think if he were to look at it today, he would be like, well, this is clearly a institution that has outlived its usefulness. It leads to all sorts of bad uh, um, incentives, a lot of corruption. I mean, I think, and this would just be one thing where Aristotle would be like, wow, this nation has really got itself in a bind. I mean, he would be like, we need to get all these lobbyists out of here, all this money that's being spent on electoral campaigns. This ought to go. Unlike other countries where you're not allowed to campaign for, months or years on end, America does that. He would say that's terrible as well. What a waste of resources. It leads to social conflict of all sorts. Aristotle would probably look at American governance and be like, this is some messed up stuff. Um, C, a video maybe on the parables found in the New Testament. Does that sound like something I would do a video about? I mean, if I generally, when I do a topic, do I do a video on a complex topic, or do I do a whole series of videos? And so, I could do something on the parables in the New Testament. Does that sound like something that I typically do? Do I do a lot of stuff in religious studies, or do I focus mostly on philosophical texts? And if you want to see that sort of thing, if you want to commission videos, that we could do that. But I've got a lot of philosophical content to do first. Warbit, do you think the big questions have been answered by available philosophy? Do theories need to start being created through an engineering lens? I can't, I can think of worse things to do than creating through an engineering lens, but with the engineers and engineering professors that I know, um, it would be pretty bad. Engineers quite often are good at one thing and pretty awful at a lot of other things, including higher level thinking. So, hell no. I mean, if I had to pick a profession that I wanted to like turn philosophy over, it sure as shit wouldn't be engineers. I think I'd rather turn it over to medical people, and that would be a catastrophe too, or to lawyers, and that would be a catastrophe too, or to communications professors, and that would be a semi catastrophe, because at least they study some humanities based things. And Have the big questions been answered? Sure, the big questions have been answered. There's like a whole bunch of answers out there. You got to figure out which ones you actually think are right. Have they been answered in the sense of like there's definitive consensus on the answers to the big questions? Hell no, and there never has been. And anybody who tries to tell you that there is, way off. So yeah, we also shouldn't like turn things over to the mathematicians or the computer science people or the economists. I mean, Plato already had Socrates talk about that in the Apology, right? Craftspeople, technites, who know one thing quite well, they have knowledge about that, and then they think that they know about all sorts of other stuff as well. Um, all right. Ethan Bishop, do you have you read Philosophy Drunk? Yeah, sure. I mean, it's not recommended. You're probably gonna miss things, but I drank plenty back in undergraduate and graduate school, and sometimes I'd come home and read some philosophy, but I didn't get that much out of it. It's harder to follow complex things. I'd more read literature or stuff like that. Um, and let's see what else we got. Um, Barless, what are your thoughts on William Blake as a philosopher? Don't really have any because I haven't studied Blake much. So, Endless Nameless, what are some good theories of knowledge for dealing with the Gettier problem? I don't know. I'm not an epistemologist and I don't do analytic stuff, which is where the Gettier problem basically belongs. MDG, do you find anything coercive in modern progressive politics? If so, what? Yeah, there's plenty of stuff that can be coercive. I mean, for a long time, I was much more of a critic of the left than I was of the right. I'm kind of a, choose who the biggest bad people, enemies, threat are kind of person. And so, you could say that from probably the 90s into the like mid 2000s, I was much more critical of the left than I was of the right. I think sometimes, identity politics, and by the way, there's just as much identity politics on the part of the right, can be kind of, silly and divisive. And I think there's a lot of people who might be well intentioned, but they get their hands on some theory and then they like start applying it in very crude ways. That often happens. I mean, I run into things where people will on the left will be like, you teaching philosophy is just, Europe, dead European white guys, and I'll be like, well, Plato wasn't white to begin with because that wasn't a category back then. He was Greek, and he thought that we were all barbarians, basically. Yeah. So these categories are not that applicable, but they'll make you jump through hoops. Is it as coercive as what's happening on the right these days? Nah, not by far. I mean, there are some places that people complain about. Oh, what about Evergreen College? That's an outlier. Go to the average college, and indoctrination isn't really taking place the way that the right wingers want to claim. That's just logical and opportunistic, and trying to get people riled up against them college educated smart people. Um, so yeah, there can be coercive stuff, and maybe there could be new coercive stuff in the future. I'll oppose those who I see as being the greatest enemies of virtue and freedom at any given time. And right now, I see the real threats coming from the right. All right, Northern Bohemian Realist. On Tuesday, I get to see Fran Lebowitz and Madison, who I think is Socrates for our time. Comment. I don't know. I mean, what does it mean to be Socrates for our time? Wandering around and asking questions, being a gadfly? Socrates is kind of an asshole, in a lot of cases. Why would you want to be Socrates? That's kind of a heavy mantle to try to wear. Um, you know, I don't know enough about Fran Lebowitz to say anything. So, um, Mark says, "Hope you're all well. Late for tonight's session. If we took the pleasurable life seriously as an option for the eudaimonistic life, what do you think that would look like? How would you live a virtuous but pleasurable life?" Well, I mean, we have some discussions of this in ancient philosophy, right? The Epicureans would probably be the best candidates for that. And Cicero, I would say, in some respects, gives us the most coherent presentation of that. He's not an Epicurean, but he's got an Epicurean friend, Torquatus, who in On the Ends, book one, gets to present the Epicurean life as one in which we would, develop the virtues instrumentally. We would also have friendships, which Epicurus thought was quite important, and we would come to value our friends' happiness and pleasure. Um, I think that we ought to pay attention to pleasure and pain, not as being like the be all and end all, but as being important. I could say, when it comes to like, so let's say we got the hedonists of like an Aristippian kind, Cyrenaic kind, um, or an Epicurean kind, or just like straight out hedonists, or even like later on, the utilitarians. We got them on one side, right? And then we've got well, we got a couple sides because we do have like some ascetics who are like anti-pleasure. They think that pleasure is bad. Some of the cynics were like that. You kind of get that impression from some moralists in the early modern and late modern period. Well, let's put them aside because they're probably wrong. But then you've got like say the Stoics, right, or Immanuel Kant, or people like that who think that it's really not. There's no moral value to pleasure and pain. And then you got like, the Aristotelian, Platonic tradition, which says pleasure is a good, it's just not the good. And, it should be an index of virtue and vice. If you're doing virtuous actions, but you don't actually get pleasure out of it, or you see other people doing virtuous actions and you don't get pleasure out of it, there's something wrong. You're not fully developed. And I'm more Aristotelian, and so I think we should pay attention to what we find pleasurable and think about it and make that part of our philosophy. We should try to seek things that go just beyond mere pleasure, but it's good to have pleasure, some pleasure, and pain is something bad, just not the bad, So yeah, all right. Lapse 9 continuum. Do you suppose the notion of choosing or affirming one's own suffering purely for its own sake might be a kind of contradiction or logical impossibility? I don't know why you would choose or affirm your own suffering just for its own sake. So maybe I don't think it's a logical impossibility. People do all sorts of goofy stuff, and that shows that it's not logically impossible. But why the hell would you want to? I think if you dug into it, you would inevitably find some for the sake of that's different than the surface level for the I'm doing this just for its own sake. You find like I'm torturing myself because I feel guilty, or I want to show how tough I am, or things like that lurking in the background, right? So, um, Faisal, this is an interesting one. What's your views on kitsch? I don't know that I actually have any views on kitsch. I mean, that's a term that's been used in aesthetics for a very long time. Um, I'm not big on like cluttery kitsch, like when like if you ever go into some of these chain restaurants and they got all this crap hung up on the wall, I guess you could say a lot of that's kitsch, and it's supposed to, I kind of think of it's there to cover up holes in the wall and to give people who don't have much to say objects to start conversation with each other. You can be like, look at those license plates over there. Um, but kitsch for its own sake isn't really valuable. I guess we could say, is it taking up the space of things that otherwise would be better to have? Kyle, do you have a favorite philosopher? I do not have a favorite philosopher any more than I have a favorite band. I would say there's people who I value more highly than others and enjoy reading more than others, but I don't have a favorite. I've gone through phases where I was like totally into somebody, um, but I left those phases behind. So I don't really have favorites. Um, Ethan, do you think Joe Biden should run for reelection? I mean, that's a good question. Ideally, I would rather see somebody else as the Democratic candidate. I mean, he wasn't my favorite candidate, although I did vote for him in this last election because I sure as shit didn't want Trump back in. Um, I mean, the part of the problem is we just how that phrase that Trump had, they're not sending their best people. We don't get the best people from either side, you know? I mean, the Republican side was a complete shit show that generated Trump, and it's still, I mean, you look at the people that are thinking about running, holy crap, you know? Um, all of them are pretty dismal. Um, but, can you think of somebody on the Democrat side who could feasibly step in and take Biden's place? Probably not. And, you know, maybe it's fine to have him in there as the candidate. He's pretty resilient, you know. He's good at saying funny stuff off the cuff. So, you know. All right. Ryan, what do you think about Fukuyama's Hegelian take on identity politics? I don't know Fukuyama's take on identity politics. If he said something recently, it's not something I've paid attention to. I mean, I wouldn't call Fukuyama all that Hegelian anyway. He's more Kojevian than Hegelian. I don't think Fukuyama reads much Hegel on his own, or at least that's my impression. Andre, do you have any advice on picking role models? Yeah, I guess what I would say is don't put them on too high of a pedestal, because they are human. And if you get too invested in a person as being like your shining star that's guiding everything, sooner or later they're going to let you down. And that's less on. Well, I mean, that is on them, but that's also on you for doing that. I can't read Cyrillic letters, so I don't know how to pronounce this person's name. But what have you read from Nikolai Berjayev? What are your thoughts on his Christian philosophy? Um, I mean, I read his Dostoevsky book years and years back. Don't remember much from it. I don't really have anything to say about Berjayev. So, uh, Lapse. I suspect you could always uncover ulterior motives as well. I have a hard time making sense of that idea. Must be a reference back to something else. Oh, the choosing one's own suffering, right? Yeah. So, all right. Um, Barless, thoughts on Thomas Merton's approach to Eastern philosophies? It's been more than 20 years since I've read Thomas Merton, so I don't really remember. Mario, what do you think about Jordan Peterson's interpretation of the Bible, especially Exodus? I'm sure it's garbage because Peterson is mostly garbage. The stuff that he occasionally gets right, you can find in better authors. So, Bradley, why do you think there's a gulf between political theory and practice? Why is wisdom and virtue removed from the discourse? Why aren't political philosophers taking a stand against the buffoonery? Political philosophers are taking a stand against the buffoonery. You can just, they have been for generations and centuries. Why is there a gulf between political theory and practice? By practice, what do you mean? Like the way things are done? I mean, again, common theme going all the way back to beyond Plato, going back to Solon. You read his lyric poetry about injustice and stuff like that. Politics is messy. People, you know, sometimes are motivated by good reasons and sometimes just by greed or by stupid ideologies that they've bought into or the chance to screw over their neighbor or pick whatever you want. I mean, um, do you think it's likely that we're going to see a complete coincidence between some political theory and actual practice? I have rarely seen that. Another thing with Cyrillic writing. What do you think of the philosophy of Levinas? Who is cooler, Levinas or Henri? I'm guessing Michel Henri. Um, I mean, I don't think of Levinas or Henri as being cool because I don't think very often about philosophers as being cool. Levinas is okay. He's doing some interesting stuff. My mentor Garth Gillen was actually an early translator of Levinas with his mentor Alfonso Lingus before eventually he pulled out of the translation thing. So I got fed a kind of heavy dose of Levinas. Levinasians often tend, in my experience, to be kind of whiny, down, pessimistic people who are like, we're all effacing the face of the other, and theory is all hypocrisy. And you're like, so what do you suggest we do then, buddy? And I've just kind of like ignored most Levinasians. Levinas does have some interesting stuff on interpretation of scripture and Talmud that often gets overlooked. Michel Henry is not somebody I've actually spent any time on. He was part of this. He was part of this big, like in France, the French turn to religion and phenomenology, which is a real misnomer because it's not as if the French ever quit in phenomenology focusing on religion. There's Jean Ehring, there's Gabriel Marcel, there's Paul Ricoeur, there's all these people who were doing that. All right, Saeed, thoughts on Zizek? I'm not very interested in Zizek. His early works, where he's more rigorous, sort of like Derrida, are very interesting and insightful. I think at a certain point, he just started, thinking he could just like spiel out whatever he wanted, and it takes so much time to figure out what the hell he's actually trying to say, that I don't find it particularly valuable. So, Andre, just giving a thumbs up. Thanks. I'm bursting. Is Hegel's phenomenology compatible with his logic? Are they two ways into the same conclusion? I mean, tell me what the conclusion is if you want that answered, because I sure as hell don't know. I wouldn't frame it in terms of a conclusion, and I don't know what you mean by compatible. I mean, you would think that they would be, since the same guy wrote them not too far apart. You mean the science of logic, right? Not the encyclopedia logic. Um, I mean, it's clear that one is not, even though they're intended that way, one is not really like the introduction to the other. They're doing very different things. They're both very difficult works, very complicated. I wouldn't say that it's very. I wouldn't say that it's particularly useful to try to theorize about their interconnection without spending a lot of time with them. And I spend, relatively little time with the science of logic in the last 20 years or so compared to the phenomenology. So, all right. Mario S, another topic. What's your opinion on the new Green Deal, climate change, and green growth? I mean, it's evident that climate change is taking place. You just got to like open your eyes and pay attention, and not like buy into denial crap. It was evident years ago. I mean, you can see here in Wisconsin that the winters are milder, and we have species moving north from Illinois into Wisconsin, and there's other things that are taking place as well. We're lucky living here in the Great Lakes region because climate change is not going to mess us up the way it is other places. A lot of the American South is going to become uninhabitable, within a few decades. And we're going to have to figure out what to do with all those refugees from red states in the South, as they come up here and, you know, want to live their rather thoughtless lifestyle up here. The Green New Deal, I mean, we need something like it. And I mean, this is one of those examples of something where our political system is just doing a terrible job. We have a party that has been like bought out by climate change deniers for years and years and years, and has like basically superstitious ideas about, you know, climate and the environment and things like that. And then we have another party that's pretty ineffective and often beholden to corporations. And there's not a lot of people like the Lorax speaking up for the trees, but we're all going to be screwed because of it, um, and because of foolishness and greed and an unwillingness to do the things that need to be done. Um, so we'll see if we can, manage to deal with things. I mean, the smart money for over 2 decades has been on, yes, climate change is real and it's a real problem. The Rand Corporation, our military have been planning for, the crises that are going to come about due to climate change. Insurance companies, they believe climate change is real because they're going to start charging more and more premiums for living, along the coast or in floodplains or in places that are going to be hit by drought and stuff like that. So, yeah. Kenneth, will a fully functional AI coming online be about a greater philosophy? So, we don't know that AI will ever happen. AI is a metaphor, not a reality. Everything that we've got so far is not intelligence, or machine learning is not actually learning. Um, Maybe we'll see something like that happening. I have a hard time thinking that it'll be able to understand philosophy particularly well. Certain technical topics, maybe yes, but I don't even know that AI will be able to handle logistics particularly well. Uh, Ethan, do you think Trump should be convicted for violating the Espionage Act? I mean, Trump should be convicted for a whole ton of stuff. I mean, he's a terrible person who's been defrauding the public and contractors for decades. Um, Nobody should be handling him with kid gloves. He should die in prison, the way that so many other people who have done similar crimes have. Mark says, Vase, this is Simone Weil, argues that when Christ said he came not to uphold the law but to fulfill it, this was not limited to Mosaic law. Other religions could be read through a Christian lens. What do you think of that? I think we got to be careful reading other religions through a Christian lens, what that Christian lens looks like, so that it doesn't wind up being one more um, sort of like good intention missionary work that effaces the other religion. Um, and I mean, there is some interesting stuff, some discussions about this in not so much in papal encyclicals, but letters, and in other theoretical discussions where people are trying to, you know, you could say syncretize or connect together different faith traditions. But I'm not super optimistic about doing that kind of stuff. All right. Let's see here. We're at time, but I'll um, take a few more questions. So Andre has got a follow up about role models. Would you pick a role model based on your character as a whole, or based on how they display certain virtues? Well, both, of course. You know, and probably some other stuff as well. How well they communicate. How consistent they are. I mean, I don't think there would be a single criterion that you would use. And there's also availability. Who do you have that you can look to as a role model? How connected do you want to be with them, right? Mario says, do you think green capitalism is possible, or is it a contradiction in itself? I mean, almost nothing's a contradiction in itself when you start getting down to it. I mean, this would be something where you could so easily just like look around for companies that are claiming to be engaged in sustainability or following the triple bottom line or stuff like that. And then ask yourself, are they actually still involved in capitalistic, uh, you know, structures and flows and economies and stuff like that? I mean, the answer I think is yes, but it's not as if capitalism is just one single thing. There's lots of ways to do capitalism, right? um Austin, any thoughts on Christopher Hitchens? Totally overblown. I don't think that he was particular. I think he was very clever, but I think he was kind of a dork. I never found him really great to read or to listen to myself, but I guess a lot of people like him. um Emil, are you optimistic or pessimistic about rehabilitation? I'm not either, because that's too vague and general of a question for me to be optimistic or pessimistic about. So some people are saying thanks for the discussion and the AMA. I've got a Another thing I got to get to at 2 o'clock. But yeah, good questions. Got to talk about some philosophy, some politics, some music stuff, a nice mix. So I think we'll bring it to a close here and say thanks to everybody for showing up. And we do these every month. Um, so you can get in on those. We got a couple other things coming up later this month. We're doing finally getting to the worlds of speculative fiction and talking about Philip K. Dick and androids and humans. We got a few other. Oh, I'm talking at Stoicon X Midwest next Saturday, which you can find on my Reason IO calendar and also in my Facebook events. There's something else, but I'm not remembering what it is. So, all right. Well, have a great evening. Those of you who are much further east of where I am here in Milwaukee, have a great afternoon. Those of you here in the Americas, and if anybody's tuning in from yet further west, further east, depending on how you're doing it, and it's the middle of the night, um, you know, get some sleep, and I'll see you next time.